On May 29th, 2016, what began as a scenic drive along Maui's winding Hana Highway ended in a deadly plunge off a cliff. A crash involving twin sisters, Anastasia and Alexandria Duval. Known for their inseparable bond, the sisters had a history of volatile interactions that culminated in a shocking car crash that claimed Anastasia's life. Their story delves into a dark and tangled past, culminating in a fatal plunge off Maui's Hana Highway that left the world questioning, was this a tragic accident or did years of buried tension erupt? And welcome to Shall We Brew? I'm your host, Haley. Here we talk about true crime, bizarre stories, and shocking scandals, all while honoring the voices of victims. You can expect a new episode every Tuesday. And I hope that everyone had a great holiday. If you do celebrate, if you don't, I hope you had a wonderful few days off of work, hopefully. But enough of the chatter. Let's get started. So pour yourself a cup and settle in, because once we start brewing, the truth can't be unsipped. The twins were born in Utica, New York in 1978 as Allison and Ann Dado. Just to clarify, Allison will become Alexandra, and she has a bigger, more dominant personality, and Ann becomes Anastasia. And it's said that she is to be more level-headed, kind, and one of the sweetest people you would ever meet. They had an older sister. She was just 2 years their senior. And sadly, the girl's mother tragically died when they were at the age of 5. They did attend Notre Dame High School, where both were cheerleaders, and then they were cheer captains. They also ran track. So they pretty much just always had a very active lifestyle. Anastasia and Alexandra, they're described as inseparable, almost as if they have one soul in 2 bodies. They would finish each other's sentences, and they always knew what the other one was about to say. And in between all the fighting, they were just normal sisters. Okay, so a lot of times when you think of twins, one might think they're inseparable. More or less, it's like having a built-in lifelong best friend, right? Well, with Alexandra and Anastasia, they had an incredibly volatile relationship. And I don't mean your average arguments where there might be some shouting, maybe possibly some name calling. You never know with siblings. I'm not talking about your normal everyday sibling argument. These two would full on start physically attacking each other. And it didn't really matter who was around to see it either. They would get in like full on brawls, hair pulling, slapping, punching, just physically fighting as full on adults, not children. So the two have an entrepreneurial spirit, and they moved to Florida in 2011, and they decide to open up a yoga studio called Twin Power Yoga. On Yelp, it states, Twin Power Yoga is an international teaching school. They offer hot vinyasa-style yoga classes. The studios are founded on the concept of absolute self-acceptance and self-love. Twin Power Yoga was born after the twins realized their highest purpose was to share the peace and serenity they encountered on their journey with others. Which we'll get more into the story, but I think that they had a hard time finding that peace and serenity later on. The studio was featured on a local news station where the twins are seen promoting their business. Their business gained quite a bit of traction. They were able to open up a second studio in West Palm Beach, and they even created an instructional fitness DVD. Some might say they became local celebrities. One woman stated the twins saved her life with their teachings. And it seemed like in their community, they had a lot of impact through yoga and their yoga teachings. They also had matching Porsche Boxsters and lived in a very nice high-rise apartment in Palm Beach. And one day, out of the blue, a producer approaches the twins about doing a reality TV show. Producer of the show then talked the twins into getting a more expensive and bigger space for their studio. And the show is kind of conflicting. So there's some reports that state the show is going to be about all these different personalities and getting them all together in a house. But then there was another couple of articles that state it was going to be about two sisters who ran a yoga studio, which I could totally see on like maybe E or TLC. I don't know. I was just kind of curious as to what network it would have been on. It doesn't really matter. So the twins get their new studio space and they can't afford it. They plunge themselves into debt and the show never happened. They were full on banking on the TV income to make the new space work. And this is really when things start to unravel. But I do want to rewind a little bit so we can really get a grasp on how the twins behaved, because this is a very important factor in this case. So, while living in Florida, Anastasia, who was originally named Anne, dated a chef for more than 6 months, and he witnessed explosive fights between the two, which often erupted without warning in public spaces. Keith is his name, the boyfriend, states, "I once got a call from Anne saying, 'Get over here now. I'm going to kill her.' And she actually started hitting Allison, aka Alexandria, with the phone. I heard it. Thump, thump, thump. They were both screaming at each other. I get to the apartment and there's broken glass everywhere, from wine bottles and shattered glasses. There was blood everywhere and the bedroom door was falling off its hinges. And both of them were sitting on the couch when I walked in and they were like, 'Hey, how are you doing?' Allison had a bruise on her face. I asked them if they were okay, and they were like, 'Yeah, we're good. We're fine. We're just watching a movie.' Meanwhile, all around them, it's total destruction. They seem to not know they just wanted to kill each other minutes earlier. Keith also mentions them fighting in a car on at least 2 occasions, and that both scuffles were very intense. And shortly after the second incident, Keith decides that he's breaking up with Anastasia. In his words, he says, "We were driving home and they wanted me to stop so they could get some wine. But I didn't want to stop. And Anne, well, she started kicking my hands, kicking them off the steering wheel. Allison was kicking the windows and they were screaming, 'I want you to stop.' I told them, 'You're going to end up killing us.' And they didn't care." So in 2014, the twins abruptly closed their studios, leaving employees unpaid and ripping off customers who had already purchased memberships. And a lot of them had purchased new memberships off of like a Groupon deal that they had just put out. One employee stated around this time, the twins' behavior started to become more erratic and disorganized. They didn't really seem to be connected, and they didn't know what the other twin was doing. Like, they would call the studio and ask questions and not know what their sister was up to. I think it's worth mentioning, Alexandra did say the employees were paid. They were just paid late this one time, and that they, in fact, did refund customers. So the twins decide they need a fresh start. People are pretty pissed off in Florida, which understandably so. And they're thinking, let's move to Utah and we'll change our names to Alexandra and Anastasia. So Alexandra states that they moved to Utah to open up another studio, but they changed their names because they were trying to write a book and felt that their names had been tarnished on the internet and social media. And this was really just when social media started to, I won't say just started, but it was really picking up around this time. And media outlets had even dubbed them as the terrible twins of yoga. And the Utah yoga studio did not work out either. And they were approximately in debt $150,000 each, which forced them to then file for bankruptcy. During this time, the twins, they start to crash out. I do not doubt that they were under a ton of stress, but they start drinking pretty heavily and end up being arrested multiple times. So one time they were kicked out of a restaurant for drinking, fighting, and threatening the owner that they would have the mafia kill the owner. There is another police report where the twins were involved in a wreck. They were fighting, pulling hair, and their car had slid into a ditch. Both twins refused to admit that they were drinking. They reeked of alcohol. They were stumbling around as well as crying, screaming, and I mean just totally out of control. They were both charged with public intoxication and disorderly conduct. The twins were arrested another time when a call was made to their apartment after they had been fighting. So it turns out they don't really like Utah after all. Now they are going to go on their religious quest. And what's more beautiful and spiritual than Hawaii? Specifically, Maui. Apparently, they were planning to open yoga studios in Maui as well. And their religious quest doesn't really go as planned. It's not going too well. They're arrested on Christmas Eve for disorderly conduct and terroristic threatening. With this specific incident, both sisters missed their court dates. Just as a little side note. While living in Maui, the twins met two men. They soon start dating, and their names are Federico Bailey and Lonnie Dickerson. So Federico was dating Anastasia, and one day Federico and Anastasia decide, let's go on a camping trip to an isolated part of Maui. And before they go, I mean, they need supplies, so what better place to go to than Costco for camping supplies? And they don't even buy anything. Before they even walk in, they realize Anastasia has Alexandra's credit card. So now they're like, shit, we have to go back home and get the right card. So they drive home and switch out cards. And somehow Alexandra forced her way into their trip. She decided she was going with them, and that was that. So now all three are driving on the Hana Highway, and during this time, Federico was attempting to help them with their drinking, like drink less. Alexandra immediately broke their rules and snuck a whole wine bottle onto the trip. And Federico and Anastasia were not too happy about, one, her sister being on the trip, and two, her breaking the rules. I'm sure they were wanting a nice little getaway, and now they've got the third wheel bringing the alcohol. And it's not too long after they arrive at their destination, Federico goes to the bathroom. And when he comes back, Anastasia and Alexandra, the car, are all gone. They have disappeared and left Federico high and dry without a vehicle. So Alexandra was driving and Anastasia was in the passenger seat. And they're driving on the road to Hana. So this road is a 64-mile scenic drive on Maui. It's known for scenic views of waterfalls, rainforest, and seascapes. It's a single lane road, so it's like single lane each way. It has 620 curves, 59 bridges, and over 18 waterfalls. There's really not a whole lot of guardrails either. I mean, there are. There's also like natural walls made out of rock. It's also not really recommended to drive large SUVs. And instead, they recommend that you opt for a Jeep or a small convertible car that you can rent. They even have tour guides that, will like drive you around. So it sounds pretty dangerous, right? But it doesn't have to be, as long as you follow the rules. Some might say the most dangerous parts of this road are 1, lack of sunlight. You don't want to be driving at night. 2, visitors. Specifically, visitors who are busy looking instead of paying attention. Or tourists who are not paying attention at all. They're looking at their phone, they're looking at their map, they're God knows what else besides the road. It is very important, and I don't think you can stress how important it is to pay attention while you're driving on this road. So, as they're driving, there's a man named Lawrence driving behind the twins in their white Ford Explorer. And they're all driving on a very narrow portion of the road. And Lawrence, all he can see is Anastasia pulling and yanking on Alexandra's hair. And Alexandra is the one who is driving. Her head is being pulled towards the right. So then the sisters pull over. Alexandra turns towards Anastasia on the passenger side and tries to fight her sister off. When Lawrence demonstrates what he sees, he shows his arms like flailing up and down. The best way I can describe the visual is like when 2 cats are standing on their hind legs and they're fighting and they're just kind of like slapping their arms up and down. Then, out of nowhere, Alexandra throws the SUV into drive and stomps on the gas. She's just flooring it, and they launch off a 200-foot cliff. Virginia, who's working at her flower shop nearby, just hears a loud boom, sounding like a bomb. And somehow, the car did not land in water. Instead, it landed on a rock on its rear. So it's almost perpendicular. The front license plate would have been facing up towards the sky. So as you can imagine, it doesn't take long for a crowd to form, and all these people are at the top of the cliff looking down at the car. And they call 911. And while they're looking, waiting for 911, they notice it looks like someone might be moving around. The police arrive and they start making efforts to interview witnesses and rescue the bodies from the Ford Explorer. First responders are dropped down by a helicopter and they see an adult female. She is unconscious. They check the pulse and there is nothing. She's completely unresponsive. Anastasia had died on the scene. But first responders noticed something in Anastasia's hand. She had a clump of Alexandra's hair clutched in her hand, which checks out because the witness said he could see the driver's head being yanked on. Alexandra survived the crash and she was airlifted to Maui Hospital. It's pretty astounding that she was able to walk and she really had only suffered a few fractured ribs and her arm was in a sling. If they would have landed 10 feet to the left or right, they would have submerged into the water and neither would have survived. The police are investigating the wreck and they really need to talk to Alexandra. But they say she pretty much refused to open up and talk about the wreck. She remained defensive when being asked questions. Her initial reaction when the police arrived at the hospital was, "Why are you here?" She never asked about her sister, and the police ended up having to tell Alexandra. So this strikes them as odd because typically when you're in a wreck, you're like, most of the time, like if you wake up conscious, you're going to be like, where's my sister? What happened? Is she okay? And so, I don't think we can dictate how people react after that situation. But I just think, officers, they're around it quite a bit. So they tend to see what's normal versus what's not. And this really stuck out to them. So she never asked her police about her sister. And they end up having to tell Alexandria that Anastasia had passed. And while hearing the news, she just had a blank look, a blank stare, like she's completely disconnected from the situation. It's possible that she could have been in disbelief, but who knows? The officer goes to speak with the twins' father, and he tells them what happened. And the father's reaction is diabolical. I'll just tell you. Twins' father immediately says to the officer, if anyone should have died, it should have been that bitch, Alexandra. So he's saying the wrong daughter died, and I would much rather have Anastasia here. It's crazy. While Alexandra is in the hospital, the police take blood samples, and the results come back that she was 3 times over the legal limit, meaning that she was pretty intoxicated at the time of the incident. And when the twins originally left the campsite, they didn't grab their IDs or anything. So originally the authorities needed to be able to positively ID the twins. So they go to the house that the sisters were staying in. And when they knock on the door, Alexandra's boyfriend answers, Lonnie. And they ask him, can you come down to the hospital? Like, we need to confirm her identity. One sister's dead, one's alive. And just nobody knows which one's dead or alive. But what's weird about this is that Alexandra's boyfriend, he didn't have any emotion either. No reaction. Just looked at the police with a blank stare. It's so weird. Maybe that's why they were together. Maybe they don't show their emotions. I don't know. I assume that they were living together since he was there. I also find it weird that Alexandra forced her way onto the camping trip and just left her boyfriend high and dry. Did you forget about Anastasia's boyfriend already? They just left him at the campsite. What happened to him? Federico waits for them to come back, and he sleeps by himself in the tent that night. The next morning, he ends up just hitching a ride back to Hana because obviously nobody's ever coming back. He gets to his friend's house, and his friend tells him, I'm sorry, but one of them died. And like a normal person, he's shocked. He just could not believe what he was hearing. So Federico, he's shocked, but at the same time, it almost immediately makes sense. He tells police he could see it coming. Just 1 week before the incident, Alexandra informed Federico that she was going to kill Anastasia. He says that she said it again, but differently the second time, as if it already happened. So at first, she's like, I'm going to kill my sister. And then the second time, I killed my sister. Apparently, she didn't elaborate to Federico why she'd want to kill her sister. But he states there was a lot of jealousy between them. Since they were identical twins, I guess it was hard for them to look the same. And it created them to become competitive with the other. They would constantly compare themselves and try to one-up their sister. They really had this love, hate, toxic, and very tumultuous relationship. They really can't separate themselves from the other, yet they have high highs and really low lows. Federico also claims he overheard Alexandra tell Anastasia, don't freak out, we're leaving the planet on the 30th. And he immediately says that he suspected they were planning on doing a suicide pact. Federico gets even weirder, so we'll touch on that here in a minute. So now that Federico told authorities this information, the authorities are like, is it possible Alexandra was attempting to take their lives that day? Was she trying to take her sister's life? Or was this honestly an accident? Typically in a collision investigation, the investigator would start at the vehicle and then work their way back. But the car is down a 200-foot rock. So in this case, he's unable to do it that way. So the investigator immediately notices the tire marks on the road. He says the marks are unique because they were not braking. They were yaw marks. When you see braking marks, these are skid marks left by the tires on the road when a vehicle's brakes are applied forcefully, which causes the tires to slide against the pavement. Yaw marks are always curved. They have striations that indicate the direction of force that was applied to the tires. The investigator determined the marks showed the vehicle did in fact forcefully drive towards the cliff. The black box from the car showed data that there was 100% acceleration up to 3 seconds prior to the collision, and that the steering wheel was at a 288-degree turn. The data did not show any braking. They determined Alexandra survived because she was essentially in a compartment, being behind the steering wheel, the airbag deployed, keeping her in a smaller space, versus Anastasia, who was in the passenger seat. She did have airbags deployed, like from the back, front and the side, but there was more space for her body to kind of move and bounce around. Therefore, she really sustained a lot more injuries. Besides the other evidence gathered, police think it was intentional since the car went off the only part where there wasn't a wall. In that area, there was like these rocks that kind of created a wall, and they just so happened to slide off the one part that did not have a wall. So they even tested the theory that maybe this happened because Anastasia was pulling on Alexandra's hair and somehow they accidentally swerved and ran off the road. So they tested by reenacting, but ultimately they determined there was an intent to drive off the cliff. But what would her motive be? Well, after digging some information up, it turns out that Anastasia and her boyfriend, Federico, were going to open their own business on another island. Like they were just planning to move away together, away from Alexandra. The authorities' conclusion is that Alexandra was not happy about this. She didn't want to lose her sister, so if I can't have her, nobody will. I'll just kill us both type situation. So authorities gather up all the circumstantial evidence and they charge Alexandra with second-degree murder. Police go to arrest Alexandra and she had already hightailed it out of there. Apparently, she got word and decided to flee before they arrived. But they're on an island, so really there's only one of two ways that you can leave, either by plane or by boat. Police go to the airport and discover her flight had been grounded since there was a mechanical issue with the plane. And they find out she's just at a hotel nearby the airport. They find her and they arrest her. During the preliminary hearing, the judge states they don't have enough probable cause to hold her for the charge of second-degree murder. So they just release her and the judge dismisses the murder charge. Alexandra then heads back to New York, and while in New York, she is arrested. She was arrested for swerving, swaying in and out of driving lanes, and she almost hit a police investigator's vehicle. So they make her take a breathalyzer, and what do you know? Her blood alcohol level comes back more than 3 times the legal limit, and she was not wearing a seatbelt at the time. She also refused to tell anyone where she lived. She refused fingerprints and photographs and wouldn't tell the police anything while she was at the station. Ultimately, they take her into custody for a DWI. The judge actually had to make the bail higher than the original $5,000 because they found out she had a DWI in Utah. She paid the bail and then fled the state. So meanwhile, this is happening in Maui. They get the grand jury and they end up indicting her on her sister's death, which means they take her back to Maui. She pleads not guilty for the second time. She's now looking at life in prison for her sister's death. And just as a side note, the prosecutor said they didn't try to get other charges like reckless driving or drunk driving because they thought the evidence was compelling enough to show that this was an intentional act. The definition of murder in Hawaii is literally causing the death of another person. So they really thought, even though their evidence is circumstantial, that it was totally going to be enough. I also wanted to bring up that Alexandra's attorney tried to, as a defense, blame the accident on Anastasia pulling Alexandra's hair, which, intentional act or not, I just don't know how you could let your dead sister be blamed for the accident. And I understand that she is looking at life in prison, but sometimes the defense that attorneys decide to take on is shocking. I mean, she is sort of a victim. Like, she died at the end of the day, you know? Anyways. So Lawrence, the witness, the guy who was driving behind them that day, he also testified in court about what all he saw happen.
That is correct. I could not even see into the passenger's side.
Okay, but you could see the passenger from, you said, the arms, elbows?
From the elbows to the hands.
And you could see two hands?
I could see two hands yanking on hair.
And both hands had their hands on
Yes.
the driver's hair.
Yes.
And they were pulling it so violently that the driver's head was jerking over
Yes.
the passenger's.
I could not even simulate how much it was pulling, and it would hurt my neck.
Okay, and this happened repeatedly.
Yes.
Do you know how many times?
I would not be able to count. It was during pretty much the whole time that I was watching.
Then Federico, who's Anastasia's boyfriend, says in court that he learned that Anastasia died. He saw Alexandra, and just brace yourselves, okay? Literally learns that Anastasia dies, and then next he sees Alexandra, and he gave her a shower and washed her hair, and says they just sat down after that. I mean, what in the actual fuck? That is the most wild thing I think I have heard in a case. Like, but I cannot believe that he would admit that in court. And this is why I said that he was controversial. Because on one hand, he's saying, oh, no, a week before, she was talking about killing her. She says she's going to kill her, and then says that she did kill her. And then literally, you just learned your girlfriend died, and you're showering her sister. What the? Oh my God. I don't know. Moving on. So to me, this just doesn't really add up, because he tells police that Alexandra said that she was going to kill her sister. He also talks about the strange behavior from Alexandra, such as Alexandra putting on all of her sister's clothes and started dressing like Anastasia. He said it was disturbing, but he didn't question it. I'll get to my thoughts in a minute. This trial was a bench trial, so there was not any jury, and the judge ultimately decides on the outcome. And the judge says one of the most dramatic pieces of evidence in this case is the hair. The hair that was in Anastasia's hand. The judge's verdict says the defendant lost control of the vehicle, and maybe she didn't put the left turn. She may have done that, but that's as a result of the evidence shows her hair was being pulled. And whatever happened, happened. She wasn't responsible for that. The court will enter a judgment of acquittal, and the defendant is discharged. So, after all of this, Alexandra does an interview with Dr. Phil. I would love to show you clips, but I personally would love to not be sued. So, I'll have a link in my show notes where you can watch the full interview on YouTube. But the police mentioned earlier that anytime they would ask anything about her sister, the incident, any questions, she would come off as defensive. And when you watch this interview, you can see exactly how she comes off as defensive. And she was pretty much in denial about majority of the questions that Dr. Phil would ask her, like about employees not being paid. Like she couldn't remember telling the owner of a restaurant that they were going to send the mafia after them. Like she just was like, I don't know anything about that. So I thought it was interesting. And I feel like that interview actually gives you some insight on maybe it's just her behavior that she just kind of comes off as like there's a wall there and she's just kind of cold and defensive about it. She could be like that with any question. Well, we don't know. Just some input. Oh, and also, she showed up the first time to do the interview with Dr. Phil, but they were unable to do it because she was under the influence. So she basically calls Dr. Phil back later and is like, I want to do it. And then she does it sober, which is the one that you can see. Anyways, that is all I have. I don't know about this one. It's a wild ride for sure. A lot of people think it was an accident. More people just seem to think that it was a suicide pact, and others think it was murder. But I do want to say, if she was truly going to kill someone, I just don't believe driving off a cliff is the first method of choice. I think that both Anastasia and Alexandra struggled with alcohol. There were people who would say they both completely changed, like their behavior, their demeanor when they had alcohol. And typically that means you need to cut your relationship from alcohol and make the journey to become sober. But, only one person can determine that for themselves. I think that they were very impulsive. I don't think that they thought things through. I especially don't think they thought like what the bad consequences would be of their choices and their decisions. It's like that part of their brain never got there and just never fully developed. And so I kind of think Anastasia was pulling their hair, they were fighting, and it could have just been a split second decision. Like you're angry and you're just like, psh, I don't know. I just think that they were both very impulsive, and maybe she just had an intrusive thought and let that thought win. I honestly don't know. I guess we'll never really know. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, I'm eager to hear that. Let me know if you have any case suggestions below. I'll have a link to where you can put that in. As always, stay safe, stay curious, and I will see you next week.